Good afternoon. Professor Barry Cunliffe is, without argument, one of the most influential archaeologists working in Europe today, and we are extremely honored to have him here at Brigham Young University. He was born and raised in Portsmouth and lived his life in that area, and he discovered very early a love of archaeology, and he made a habit of seeking out sites that he heard about in the landscape around his home in southern England at a very early age. He began a more formal pursuit of the discipline at the University of Cambridge in 1959, where he completed both his undergraduate and graduate degrees. Following his formal schooling, Professor Cunliffe accepted a professorship at the University of Southampton and served for 6 years as the chair of their newly founded Department of Archaeology. From there, he went on to accept the prestigious position of Professor of European Archaeology at the University of Oxford, where he spent the majority of his academic career. Throughout this career, Professor Barry Cunliffe has spearheaded a series of exceptional field projects in both England and abroad. These have included excavations at Fishbourne Roman Palace, the Roman Baths at Bath, where he braved the excavation of the sacred spring armed with a somewhat temperamental water pump, the Danebury Project, Hengistbury Head, the Lyote Project in Brittany, and most recently fieldwork in Iberia. One of these, the Danebury Project, has undeniably been the most extensive, spanning more than 35 years. Through these years, this investigation of an Iron Age hill fort and its surrounding landscape has involved archaeologists in their hundreds, as well as volunteers. Archaeologists fortunate enough to be Danebury trained, as we call ourselves, have benefited from Professor Cunliffe's hands-on approach to archaeology. Always one to lead from the front, it is not uncommon to find Professor Cunliffe at the bottom of a fortification ditch in torrential rain, atop a photographic tower in an electrical storm, or painstakingly excavating a crumbling mosaic in sweltering heat. This unparalleled discipline and dedication to the discipline has been reflected in his numerous publications, his TV appearances, and his radio presentations. Through these media, Professor Cunliffe has endeavored not only to further the discipline, but also to bring the excitement and fun he personally finds in the subject to academic and public audiences alike. The use of archaeology as entertainment is typified in his life by things such as his extraordinary voyage of Pythias the Greek, a book which he began writing as a diversion while on holiday in Brittany while he was housebound by a rainstorm. In this way, Professor Cunliffe's contagious enthusiasm has inspired generations of archaeologists, of which I am very honored to be included. Today's lecture will run roughly an hour and then be followed by a question and answer period for which we invite you to stay and make use of the opportunity to talk to Professor Cunliffe. So without further ado, I am honored and delighted to introduce Barry Cunliffe as the 2008 Grace Elizabeth Shallit Memorial Lecturer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jamie. Ladies and gentlemen, I had no idea when I chose my title today for today's lecture that it was going to be on St. Patrick's Day. We must be blessed indeed for this. And I'm reminded here, much more than I would be in England, how important St. Patrick's Day is by the display of green around. I'm going to talk, as you'll see, on the subject of who were the Celts. Now, I think it's fair to say that if I'd offered this title 20 years ago, people would have said, why that title? We know who the Celts are. It's dead easy. We've got the main story. But things have happened very recently in Celtic studies. There have been people who have said we shouldn't even use the word Celt. It doesn't mean anything. There has been a real upsurge in interest and a contribution from a whole range of different disciplines. So I think in Celtic studies we're now on the cusp of changing direction totally. And what I want to do today is to introduce some of the traditional things we know about the Celts, because I fully understand that many of you will not be familiar with the material or the locations. So I'll do that first. and then move on to the slightly more contentious things about who were the Celts, their ethnicity, where were they, their language, and the impact of DNA, the impact of new linguistic studies, and so on. And we'll see where we get within the hour. Let me begin with a quotation from someone you probably all will know, but not in the guise of being a Celtic scholar, J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was a great scholar in his own right, an Oxford academic who specialized in language. And he gave a prestigious lecture, the O'Donnell Lecture, which is a Celtic dedicated lecture, in 1963. And he says in it, and this is our text for today, to many, perhaps most people outside a small company of great scholars past and present, Celtic of any sort is a magic bag into which anything may be put and out of which almost anything may come. Anything is possible in the fabulous Celtic twilight, which is not so much a twilight of the gods as of the reason. Now, there he was poking fun at contemporary linguists who were discussing all sorts of minute trivia, and was saying that essentially Celtic, the word Celtic, means different things to different people. And it certainly meant different things to different people in the past. And what we've got to try and do is to distill out of the many uses of the word Celtic something hopefully useful to us in our understanding of the past. Now, a traditional view, a 20-year ago view of who the Celts were is depicted there, and it gives you the basic geography. The thoughts then were that the Celts originated in this part of Europe, broadly speaking eastern France across through southern Germany, and based on what the classical writers told us, that the Celts spread down into Italy, across down into Greece and into Anatolia. We'll talk about these things in a moment. And you see from these big, thick black arrows, the Celts are expanding into Britain and down into Spain. This, as I say, is the traditional view that was held, and still is held by some people, but was held by most up to 20 years ago. And when I was an undergraduate, it was perfectly reasonable to face an exam question such as, when did the Celts come to Ireland? No one would conceive of asking that question now, because it's meaningless for a reason which I hope you'll appreciate by the time we get to the end. In other words, that big black arrow of Celts moving across to Britain, archaeologists no longer accept. Now, there is also a chronological problem here. The peoples who made these moves, historic moves, down into Italy and into the Balkans and further, were people whose culture, archaeologically, we can recognize. It is the culture of the Latin period. You see it there. But the dates are around about 400 BC onwards for these movements. However, there were Celts, or so the classical sources tell us, down in Greece. Down in Iberia. How did they get there? How did the Celtic language spread there when there is no sign of Celtic Latin culture in the Iberian Peninsula? Clearly, there were problems with this model, even at the time when it was first developed. And you'll hear something of the development later. So we start by saying that the old views of, the old packaged views of 20-odd years ago, when people said you could put what the classical writers said about Celts, you could put the philological data on Celts, the language, you could put the archaeological material of Latin culture, you could put them all in one bag and shake them up, and there were the Celts. That's very much what Tolkien was saying there. Nowadays, we say, no, let us deconstruct that. Let's pull that package apart, and let's try and understand it in modern terms, not in the terms of 200 or 300 years ago. Now, let's first of all look at the, I'll go back one moment. The Celts, to the classical writers, well, I think we have to distinguish two phases of classical writing. One were the early Greeks, Herodotus, Hecataeus, for example, who were trying to talk about the barbarian peoples of Europe. And they were writing in the 6th, 5th centuries BC. To them, the Celts occupied this area over here in southern France, near Massalia, the port of Marseille. And there were Celts over here in the area of the Pyrenees, and there were Celts right over here against the Atlantic, Herodotus says. So in the 6th, 5th century, if you asked a Greek where the Celts were, they would say right over in the western extremities of Europe. By the time you get to the 4th century, when Roman writers are writing, they are writing about Celts coming from this northern area and moving down into Italy and into the Balkans. 200 years on, a different concept of where the Celts were. And what I will argue is that, in effect, what the Roman writers were doing was being unspecific. And they were saying that more or less anyone from the western part of Europe can be called Celtic, irrespective of what the tribes called themselves. Because their concept was that the ancient world, the barbarian world, divided into Celts down here and Scythians over here, and that was it. It was a simple twofold division. So anyone who migrated from this area would automatically be Celtic. Well, now, we know about those migrations because Roman writers and Greek writers describe them, and they give us a view, the classical view, of the Celts, these people who attacked them from the north. Strabo, for example, says the Celts were war-mad. They were people who loved to have feasts, were boasting in their feasts, would say, tomorrow I'm going to lead a raid, and everyone would put up their hands and say, I'm going to join you, and they would go off and lead a raid. They were impetuous people. Celts were war-mad, but not of evil character, says Strabo. So there is that concept. They are an enemy to be fought. And here is an image of that. It's terracotta of about the 4th century from Italy, and it shows Celts raiding and running off with their plunder, raiding probably a temple. And one of the Celts you see over here is naked, wearing a torque around his neck. And this is another view that the classical world had of the Celts. Often they went naked into battle, we're told, unarmed except for the sacred torque around their neck, which they assumed would keep them safe. And here they are running off with their plunder from probably a Roman temple or an Etruscan temple somewhere in the north. So to a Roman, that was what the Celts were like. Now let's just look at what the archaeology and the armaments of the Celts were. Here are some lateen swords, fine iron swords in bronze, in leather sheaths with decorated bronze strengthening to the sheaths, usually decorated in this period in the flamboyant form of vegetal art, these lovely flowing scrolls and so on. And there you see a number of swords all bent and buckled. Now, this is what Polybius, a Greek writer, but writing in the Roman world, says about the Gaulish sword. The Gaulish sword is only good for a cut and not a thrust. From the way their swords are made, only the first cut takes any effect. After this, they at once assume the shape of a strigil, being so much bent lengthwise and sideways that unless men are given leave to rest and put them on the ground and set them straight with their foot, the second blow is quite ineffective. Now, there you might think is a wonderful confirmation of Polybius. There are the buckled swords. Polybius is right. Not so. Those swords are, Celtic swords are very good. They don't buckle like that. These swords are deliberately bent for ritual deposition. And Polybius presumably saw swords like that and wondered why they were buckled and made up a story about them. So we've got to be careful about the classical interpretation of the archaeological evidence. The spears were the other, one of the other weapons of aggression which these warlike Celts had. Diodorus is quite impressed by Celtic spears. He says, some have breaks along their entire length, so that the blow not only cuts, but also tears the flesh, and recovery of the spear rips the wound open. Romans' view of warfare and the quality of weapons. These are a couple of Celtic spears, very fine ones, elegant shape. These don't have notches along their edges. This one is beautiful. It comes from the Thames, decorated with bronze curvilinear design. So the Romans knew a lot about these spears. They were on the receiving end of them. And indeed, some of the spears that we do find do have notches in them. And those notches would have been very effective for making the wound open and bleed so that one lost strength wherever one was wounded. They also had other weapons. They had slings. Sling stones were quite important. In the hill fort that Jamie mentioned that we excavated at Danebury, we found lots of sling stones, pebbles, which were stockpiled, ready to defend the entrance to the hill fort. Sling, very, very effective weapon. In fact, the excavators during Danebury decided to become effective slingers, and they made their own slings out of the excavation string. They used the sling stones, and during lunch breaks they practiced slinging. It was very, very dangerous to go into the hill fort during that stage. And they found that they could easily, you sling this way, and you can let go. And if you could let go at the right moment, they could hit a tree, a narrow tree, at about 30 or 40 feet quite easily after a little bit of experience. So the sling, very effective, very cheap. Anyone could have a sling. Anyone could make one. They also sometimes use bows and arrows as well, but not very often. Now, for defense, body armor, they used shields. One of the Roman writers talks about their shields being man-sized. That is, they're not little round things. They're good body protection. You would have it hanging on your left arm, and it would protect you from the chin down to the knees. And there is a sculpture in southern France of a Celt holding a typical Celtic shield, probably made from wood with the central umbo, that feature there, which protects the hand, that central umbo made of metal. But just show how simple they can be, there are actual wooden shields there from a ship, a votive ship which was put into a bog in Denmark, a place called Hjort Spring. And it's made, you see, from a single plank of wood. It's a very easy thing to make, a shield like that. And behind that umbo would be the hand grip. And if you use light wood, you could fend off an attacker very effectively. One of the shields that, or rather the remains of one of the shields that I excavated on one of the Channel Islands, which is just off the British coast, between Britain and France, was made of layers of wood and faced back and front with leather, a sort of plywood effect. Very effective, and if you hit it with a sword, the sword would simply bounce off. So a very effective form of body defense. And helmets, a selection of Celtic helmets. Diodorus again. On their heads, they wear bronze helmets, which possess projecting figures, lending the appearance of enormous stature to the wearer. In some cases, horns form one part with the helmet, while in other cases, it is the four parts of birds or quadrupeds. Now, there is the classic helmet with horns on it. The idea to make you look tall, make you look fierce. That's the only horned helmet we know, but it comes from the River Thames near Waterloo Bridge. It was dredged up. And every reconstruction in every school book wears that particular helmet, although it's the only one we've got. And that's a helmet from Italy, that's from the northern Britain. See, it's rather like a baseball cap, and it's worn like a baseball cap turned round, with that being the neck guard there. And it had side pieces rather like these, hanging down to protect the cheeks. And many of them had visors on the front to deflect any glancing blow from a sword. So very effective indeed. But the 4 parts of birds and quadrupeds sounds rather silly. But some of the helmets, like this one, have little holes on the top. And we have small bronze models of boars, which were a symbol of protection for the Celts. And some of these helmets had boars on them, and that one would have had. So that's what Diodorus is talking about. But the 4 parts of birds, well, here is the classic helmet with a bird on it from Romania, from Transylvania, right in the center of the Carpathian Mountains. And this is an amazing helmet. You see the typical Celtic helmet here with this wonderful bird on it, with it's a raven or a bird of prey of some sort, with red glassy eyes that stare at you. And the really neat thing about this is that the wings are hinged, so that if you're wearing this and running at your opponent, the wings would actually flap. But one would hope the helmet wouldn't take off, but it would flap. And imagine the effect of that, a great hairy warrior running at you with his helmet flapping. And there you see, also from Romania, someone wearing one of these helmets with a bird perched on it. Now, to someone like Diodorus, he could say this. It would be quite interesting. It would sketch out the Celts to his reader as being someone curious, not like us, as it were. But in fact, it's terribly important because in Celtic mythology, the raven was often the form in which certain of the gods turn themselves in a shape-shifting mode to be the people who swept down and grabbed people and carried them off. The end of your life would be presaged by a bird, the vision of a bird coming down and sweeping you in its claws, taking you away. So wearing this on your helmet and going into battle and facing your enemy would see the idea of the great bird sweeping down on him, ready to grab hold of him. His days would be numbered. So it would have a tremendous psychological effect. Now, the other elements of battle were fascinating. The carnix, the Celtic war trumpet, which you see here in various forms. There are actual war trumpets, bits of them found from Britain, the long tube and the mouth in the form of a boar's head, the boar again being the symbol of strength. Here on a cauldron found in Denmark are 3 horn blowers, and you see again the animal's head, and here's just an artist's reconstruction. But one of the classical writers again talks about how blowing into the horns produces a raucous sound, which he says suits the tumult of war. And he goes on to say that when this noise is blowing and when the warriors are shouting and screaming, it seems as though the whole land has taken up the great war cry. Psychologically, of course, this completely understandable. The use of noise in warfare is very well known. One thinks of one of my favorite films, Apocalypse Now, and the helicopter gunships going down and blaring out the Ride of the Valkyries. Great noise to distract and to discourage. When we have the occasional prison riot in Britain, as we do from time to time, noise, particularly loud rock music, is used to destabilize the rioters. Noise is very, very important in warfare. So we can begin to understand how the Celts used all this. The other item in warfare, which was very important indeed, was the chariot. We have here a chariot burial, a human buried with his two-wheeled chariot. This is from northern England, and you can see the iron tires of the wheels here, and even the wooden spokes showing. So a two-wheeled chariot, and here in the archaeological record, a lot of material that decked out the horse, or the horse bit, and the linchpin which kept the wheels on the hub, and various glossy, shiny trappings to put on the reins to make it shine and glitter. So again, display, art being used in the context of warfare. We know we've got a remarkable description of the Celtic chariot in war. There is a reconstruction of a chariot, very much a simple platform. And it's Julius Caesar who attacks Britain in 55 and 54 BC, and he comes up against Celtic chariots for the first time. And he gives a description of this. Now, Caesar is impressed by this. And I'm just going to read you this because it's quite an accurate description of how you could use these. In chariot fighting, he says, the Britons begin by driving all over the field and hurling their javelins, and generally the terror inspired by the horses and the noise of the wheels are sufficient to throw their opponents' ranks into disorder. Noise again. Then, after making their way between the squadrons of their own cavalry, they jump down from the chariots and engage on foot. In the meantime, their charioteers retire a short distance from the battle and place the chariots in such a position that their masters, if hard pressed by numbers, have an easy means to retreat to their own lines. Thus, they combine the mobility of cavalry with the staying power of infantry. And by daily training and practice, they attain such proficiency that even on a steep incline, they are able to control the horses at full gallop and to check and turn them in a moment. They can run along the chariot pole, stand on the yoke, and get back into the chariot as quick as lightning. Now, there is a practiced general being very impressed by the method of warfare with which he was unfamiliar, which the Celts used. Combine the staying power of infantry with the mobility of cavalry. There's the mind of a tactician and a military man seeing the advantage of all this. So there are some sort of sketches of Celtic warfare through archaeological material, real archaeological material, and through the classical writers, how they perceived the Celts. We know that warfare changed over time, that to begin with, the type of warfare was very much the warfare of heroes, that in societies, warfare was damaging, dangerous, and on the whole, societies tried to avoid it, although they were very aggressive. And quite often this aggression was modulated, as it were, through single combat, when the heroes come out and they yell abuse at each other, and the heroes then fight in full view of their own people. And then when one lot of heroes have fought, another lot come out, and so on. So it's ritualized aggression fought through heroes. That's how it was to begin with. But as the Celtic peoples came into closer and closer contact with Roman and Greek armies, they had to modify their fighting to suit their classical enemies. So it becomes more all-out warfare. Now, and that is a Celtic battle shown on a Roman sarcophagus. Celts here, the Romans winning, as always. It's a Roman sarcophagus, so the Romans have got to win. And the Celts, some of them naked, being trampled by the horses, and the melee and the furor of the battle. The Celts were a noble enemy to beat. And that is one of the messages that comes out from the way, the topos that the classical writers use to describe the Celts. The Celts are different from us. The Celts are other. The Celts have billowing moustaches, for example. We tend not to at this period. The Celts are unreliable in warfare. Sometimes they're very fierce and run at you. Sometimes they run away screaming like cowards. You can't tell. The Celts get terribly drunk when they go into warfare and fall around in stupor. We don't. You know, we're controlled soldiers and so on. So everything that the classical writer says about the Celt is to counterpose against his perception of himself. So we've got to see the classical evidence in that way, and that's why it's very interesting to have the archaeology to balance against it. Now, the Romans came into contact with the Celts in various ways. I can't go into all of them, but there was undoubtedly a migration somewhere around 400 BC from the area up here north of the Alps, from eastern France, southern Germany, Switzerland, that sort of area, down through the Alpine passes into the Po Valley. And we have descriptions of how the Celts moved down, fought battles, and settled. First here, then here, then here, then here. And they settled this whole area of the Po Valley, right down the east coast, down to Ancona. And there is a mountain range, the Apennines, down here. And then, having settled in this area, they raided through the Apennines, they raided against the Etruscans at just the time when Rome, just slightly off the map, was growing in power and was pushing northwards through the Etruscans. So the Romans came absolutely into contact with these barbarians from the north. The first time the Romans had ever seen barbarians. And this comes out beautifully when the Celts attack Rome itself in 390. And just before doing that, they beat a Roman army. And the Roman consul, trying to stir up his troops just before going into battle, says words to the effect that you're now going to meet a savage enemy who will spill your blood or spill his own, not like the people we're used to fighting, townspeople, sort of in Latium and further south. These are barbarians we're not used to fighting. And indeed, the Celts beat the Romans, the Celts besiege Rome, and so on. So the Romans have got this fear inbuilt into them of the Celts as a very frightening military force, a foe that is worth beating. Later on, another band of Celts in the 3rd century BC, 279, move out of the area, well, broadly speaking now Serbia there, or the Great Hungarian Plain, that area, and they march down through the Balkans, through the pass of Thermopylae, right down to the Temple of Delphi. There is the Temple of Delphi, the famous oracle of Apollo temple there. You see the Gulf of Corinth just out here, Gulf there. This is the famous treasury where the Greek city-states had put all their treasure. It's a great sanctuary. It was a safe place. The Celts knew about it. They poured down. They attacked it. Whether they destroyed it or not, it's difficult to say. But it was a failure, and they turned around and moved back. Some of them then moved across here, across the Dardanelles, across the Bosphorus, into Anatolia. And here we pick them up. They've moved here across here, and they settle eventually in the region more or less around Ankara, in the center of Turkey now. And they carry the name Galatian with them. Quite often in classical literature they were called Gauls or Galatians as well as Celts. The names to the classical writers anyway were interchangeable. And these are the Galatians, of course, in the Bible, to whom St. Paul wrote that wonderful letter that starts off, "O foolish Galatians." You know, it's a good way to write a letter to someone. But these Galatians that St. Paul was writing to in the 1st century AD were the descendants of Celts who had settled there in the 3rd century BC and were still an ethnic group that was distinguishable at that stage. So it shows something of the coherence of these disparate groups as they move away. Now, I was talking about the topos, the way the Romans visualized the Celts in their writing. Noble savages, different from us, but worth beating because they were fierce. This is the way the Hellenistic world, the kingdom of Pergamon in Anatolia, how they depicted the Celts. Because the Celts in Anatolia, I should go back one, the Celts here, the Galatians, raided all the cities, most of the cities of the Aegean coast, famous cities like Ephesus and Miletus and places like that. And only one community stood out against them, the kingdom of Pergamon. And there were great battles, and the kingdom of Pergamon won. And what did it do? Create great monuments in Pergamon to this battle over the Gauls, what they regarded as one of their greatest battles. And here are 3 sculptures from that monument. These are Roman copies of the sculptures, but 3 sculptures. The famous one, which I'm sure most of you know, is the Dying Gaul in the Louvre. And it shows a typical Gaul going naked into battle. He's wearing his torque. He's been wounded. He's on his shield. There's his sword still close to his hand. And he's dying. There is nobility in this. The Romans recognize that. Here, another one who, with his dead wife, who is committing suicide because he has lost. And he may even have killed his wife. Another one there in a position of about to be struck down. So the Romans and the Greeks, the Hellenistic world, were in awe of the Celts. They were a real noble enemy. Now, how did the Celts see themselves? That's the Celts depicting themselves. Quite different. And these, well, you will know one of these from the poster. These are different views. This one comes from Germany. This one comes from the Czech Republic. This one from Britain. This one from France. The interesting thing is they all have similar characteristics. They all have the droopy moustaches. Each one of them, they all have their hair brushed back and these sort of lentoid eyes. Now this, I think, is very interesting because of the geographical spread of these. These people are depicting themselves in a stereotype as well. They're saying, this is who we are. We look like this. This is how we perceive of ourselves. And this suggests, I think, that there was a real sense of identity over a number of these areas, that people believe themselves to be ethnically similar. The moustache is interesting. One of the Roman writers talks about the droopy moustache of the Celts and says whenever they drink wine, they slurp it through their moustaches rather as it was going through a sieve. Again, they're barbarians. They're not like us. We're civilized. Same picture. Now, let's sort of pick up where we are. What can we deduce from the classical sources? Well, the one point is that there were a group of people here in the 4th century who shared this Latin culture, distinct culture. And from that area, people moved down into Italy and attacked the Romans. They moved across, attacked the Greeks, and so on. That much we can accept. That is good, solid history. And those people, the classical writers chose to call Celts. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. While that was going on, there were a group of people who were called Celt-Iberians here, same name, who were also doing a little bit of migrating and raiding on the side. So a time of raid and attack. The classical world was an obvious one for these people to attack because it was from the classical world that wine and fine metalwork and pottery was being traded up into the Celtic world. And they wanted a cut, really. And if your traders won't bring you enough, what do you do but go back down the trade routes and start picking it up for yourselves? And that was one of the logics of the Celtic migration. The other was undoubtedly a massive build-up of population. The classical writers talk about this. So this much we can be reasonably sure about. Now, material culture. Let me just throw this one in. I've talked about the material culture of the La Tène period. That is the material culture of this period of the migration. And here is the distribution of that material culture. Interestingly, it doesn't go down into Spain, but it does include the whole of Britain. So Britain was in some way linked into this general cultural milieu. And that was one of the reasons why archaeologists some years ago assumed that in the period of migrations, there were also migrations into Britain. The idea of the Celts coming to Britain. Now that is based, let's go on, I won't use that one. That is based on a totally different sort of concept. That is based on an old view that goes back to at least 300 years, to 1707. Now, I'm going to pick up this language thread here. If you ask where the Celtic languages are spoken, that is where the Celtic languages can now be heard. The languages of Brittany, of Wales, of Ireland, and of Scotland are all Celtic languages, or so they are called. In the past, the same language was spoken in Cornwall and the Isle of Man. Now, how do you explain this language group? The general explanation is that it's the sort of remnant, the fringe remnant of the great sort of Celtic set of languages. But we'll look at this in a bit more detail. And we have to start with this man, Edward Llwyd, who is a Welshman, and he wrote this book, Archaeologica Britannica, the languages, histories and customs of the original inhabitants of Great Britain. And this book was published in 1707, so 300 years ago. And this is the first volume of this great work he was going to produce. He produced only one volume, and it was a glossography. It was a series of word lists. He was a remarkable man. He was curator of the museum in Oxford, the Ashmolean Museum. That's the Ashmolean Museum. And he went out on field work. He went to Brittany, went to Ireland and Scotland. Very difficult to do, to travel around in the beginning of the 18th century. And he interviewed people. He made lists of words. He listened to the language. And he was the one who wrote down Celtic language for us in this great glossography. And he wanted to create a model which enables us to understand where that language, how that language came to Britain. And in 1707, he writes that the language came to Britain as the result of a series of migrations from the continent. The Celts, he said, we know about the Celts on the continent. They migrated to Britain in a series of waves and brought their language with them. Perfectly good theory for the time. But the remarkable thing is that that theory has stayed and has been the standard theory that linguists and archaeologists have used for 300 years. There can't be many theories in our world that last for 300 years unchallenged. And what the new debate is about is challenging that theory. So we need to go into it in a little bit more detail. The top diagram, it doesn't matter if you can't read the bottom one, the top diagram shows a view of how the Celtic languages developed. You've got a Proto-Celtic, which is Indo-European, and it gradually develops through time into two groups, Gaelic on the continent and Brittonic in Britain, and then they subdivide into Welsh and Cornish and Breton, Manx and so on, and Irish. So they all grow out of this great Celtic tradition, and these are sub-languages, as it were, spoken in these disparate parts of the British Isles. Now, no one, I think, would disagree with that. And this lower diagram is a very interesting piece of work, which was published only 2-3 years ago. What a series of linguists have done is to take word lists, Celtic word lists, and to subject them to a phylogenetic method of analysis, which is rather the kind of analysis which people studying DNA use. It builds up in a statistical way tree-like relationships. And the diagram below shows their complex discussion of Celtic and the various forms of Celtic in relation to other languages. In essence, what they're saying is that the traditional model is correct, that the new phylogenetic method supports the idea of the development of Celtic. But what it does is to add some dates, because they can argue, and this I'm less sure about, but they argue that they can date the sequence of developments in terms of word changes, if word changes were fairly consistent. This is debatable, but in doing that, what they have done is to suggest that Celtic was first developed in Britain sometime, one of them says around 3000 BC, the other says even before that, perhaps about 4000 BC. Now, in the old model of the Celts moving into Britain, Celtic was introduced into Britain in that model in about 400 BC, or perhaps even 500 BC. So the new work is suggesting by itself, using its own methods, that Celtic developed very early in the British Isles, much earlier than it is attested anywhere on the continent. So a separate piece of argument. Now let's look at other kinds of evidence here. This is the distribution. I've had to turn the map up, but the distribution of where Celtic is known and the density of Celtic words known in the past. And you see that it is very much an Atlantic distribution. It incorporates Iberia, Spain, much of Western France, and most of the British Isles. That the traditional areas of the Celts seen by the Romans up here has very little Celtic language in it. So this is using just word lists and just plotting it. It suggests a greater weight, perhaps, of significance to the Atlantic, which tends to support the view of those using the phylogenetic method. Doesn't prove anything, tends to support it. So let's just build up a bit more evidence here. Recently, there's been a great deal of work on the DNA of the British population. And two major books have come out, The Origins of the British and The Blood of the Isles, all within a couple of weeks of each other, both looking at the DNA of the British population and looking at people whose grandparents have lived in areas. So you move off modern movements, you slice those off and choose your population and you test their DNA. And by this phylogenetic method, it is possible to work out the origins of both the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome DNA. And there is one map from the work of the geneticists, which describes the movement of people after the Ice Age, when the ice, I should have said that the ice in the last Ice Age moved down over most of Europe, down this far, and the populations were pushed out into Mediterranean refuges. And then as the ice went back, so the populations moved up and colonized. And what the genetics is saying, that there was a major colonization of Britain in the Mesolithic period from this refuge along the Atlantic seaways. And if you look at the population of the Irish now, the genetics of the average Irish person, 88% of them have a genetics which link them back to this movement in the early period, probably in the Mesolithic period. There's some doubt about the exact date. But, and then Welsh, 81% of the population of modern Wales relates to genetics coming from this area. And even in England, with lots of overlaps of other population, 68% of our genetics. So in other words, the simple story is that the bulk of the British population got into Britain in the very early period, the Mesolithic and early Neolithic period, and there was very little overlay of population after that. The old view of continuous migrations of people into Britain in the prehistoric period, great waves of Celts sweeping in, no evidence for it in the genetics at all. And in fact, some Irish geneticists have recently done a very interesting study looking specifically to try and find Central European genetic signatures in the Irish population, which they say could represent the Celts moving into Ireland. There was no trace whatsoever. So in other words, the genetics is showing that there was no significant movement of people. So, we've got to bring all these bits together in a moment. Let me just add a little bit more archaeology. I make no excuse for turning the map upside down. I do this usually just to shake my students in England if north is always at the top and they tend to go to sleep. But if you turn north around somewhere else, they've got to wake up and try and work it out. But there is a reason for doing this, because I wanted to emphasize the Atlantic coast here. The Atlantic fringe is archaeologically a zone, a single zone. We think of it perhaps, if we look at it with north to the top and everything, as all sort of the end of the world. But we can recognize, of course, the Mediterranean zone. But the Atlantic zone is linked by the sea. And the sea as a means of communication was of immense importance throughout prehistory. And I just want to demonstrate that. In the Mesolithic period, for example, in the hunter-gatherer period, going back sort of 5,000, 6,000 BC, burials, these are burials along the Atlantic seaways from Portugal to Denmark. And the burial rites were very, very similar. They used antler around the heads quite often. Antlers here, that's Breton, that is Danish. They used red ochre on the bodies. Very similar burial rites, suggesting not sort of great long migrations over huge distances, but communities along that seafront that were in contact with each other through short haul exchanges with neighbours using the sea. This becomes even more impressive when you move into the period of the great megalithic tombs. If some of you may know the tombs of Ireland, the great Boyne tombs of Newgrange and so on. These tombs of the period, well, you can see from my map, 4,500, 3,500. If you plot them, there is one of these megalithic tombs, great stone-built chambered tombs for the burial of a whole range of ancestors. That's in Brittany. If you plot the early ones, here they are, all up the Portuguese coast, across to these peninsulas here, up the west coast of Britain, Ireland, and Scotland, suggesting these are similar burial rites, similar art styles, similar concepts of cosmology. Some of these burials are focused on rising and setting suns at the solstice and so on. The idea that these were all independent inventions is of course no longer acceptable. We must, and other archaeology shows us that people were in constant contact, not necessarily getting on a ship in Portugal and sailing up to Scotland, but in short haul contacts. They were exchanging one community with another, both material and ideas and concepts. And this is another one of the manifestations of the Atlantic system, of the exchange of ideas following the exchange of materials in probably simple down-the-line exchange patterns. And we can build it up still further. Coming on a bit now, we're at about 2000 BC in what is called the Beaker period. This is a period when metals begin to become important. The West is metal-rich. We can find, again, using a whole range of material culture, we can talk about which areas were in contact with each other and exchanging ideas. And bring it right up to 1000 BC. This is the late Bronze Age, the map on its side again, I'm afraid. Lots of little local cultures, their own material culture quite distinctively, but sharing things from Portugal up to Scotland. Here, for example, is a stone, tombstone from down here in the Algarve. And you see the dead person with his four-wheel cart and weapons and so on, and there a particular kind of shield with a V notch in it. So very clearly depicted circular shield. Here is one of those shields from a bog in the centre of Ireland, with the same, you can just about make them out the same V notches. So elite equipment you find all the way along here being shared. Spearheads that are made in Ireland are actually found down here in southern Spain. So these people were in contact for a very long time. And the classic, I think, is looking at items in the Bronze Age. Again, we're talking about 1000 BC, thereabouts, the cauldron and the flesh hook for getting the meat out of the cauldron. These are the artifacts of the feast, of the elite, the idea of the elite coming together and the elite serving those who are dependent on them, the feast being the central item. Here are those artifacts representing the cultural zone in which that kind of feasting is important. Now, what I'm trying to say with all this, and there is huge amounts more, tons and tons and tons of this, what I'm trying to say with this is that from the Mesolithic period onwards into the Iron Age and up to the Roman period, the Atlantic Seaway was alive with cultural movement. People were moving sometimes on long distances, sometimes short distances. They were exchanging materials, particularly tin and silver and gold from those western areas were being drawn into Europe. They were exchanging cosmologies and sharing cosmologies, and they were exchanging behavior patterns of various sorts. This runs from, 6000 BC to, say, the time of the Roman conquest, 6,000 years of contact. And we can document that meticulously in the archaeological record. Now, I think my argument can now be simplified. Here is the red line, is the limit of what we would call the Atlantic system, where that great complex of interactions, of connectivity, created similarities in culture along the Atlantic seaways. I would argue that that is probably the zone in which the Celtic language developed. I'm working closely with a philologist, a colleague of mine in Aberystwyth, and he has just done a brilliant piece of work which is not yet published, which has argued that the language of the Tartessans, which is known from inscriptions, is in fact a Celtic language. And it is an unshakable argument, I think. And that dates to the 7th century BC, long before any movements of people out of Europe into these areas. So what we're arguing is that the phylogenetic methods used by some linguists to suggest that Celtic is very early are probably right, and that Celtic as a language may well have developed in this Atlantic seaways as a lingua franca, enabling people to communicate one with another. How does it get? Here is the crosshatch is the distribution of the Celtic language at its most expansive. And what you see is, in effect, that the Celtic language spreads into France. And it is the great rivers of France that I think are the key to this, the rivers which were the great trade routes from the Atlantic, ultimately into the Mediterranean. Along those rivers, commodities passed over thousands of years. And it would be logical, if Celtic was a trade language, that it too would spread along the trade routes. So it's perfectly easy to argue how the Celtic language arose and spread into the area where it is known to be spoken. So in other words, our Irish and Welsh and Breton, rather than being the remnants on the edge, the last bits to which Celtic reached, could be the remnants, all right, on the edge of the home area in which Celtic developed. And that is the debate which is now going on very forcefully in Britain at this moment. Did Celtic develop in the east and spread to the west? Did it develop in the west and spread into Central Europe? How did then Latin culture get to Britain? These are bits of fine metalwork in Britain, a shield boss and a great, horse gear, a horse pony cap there with horns attached to it. How did that art and concept get into Britain from this area where it developed? There's no doubt that this Latin art developed here. Well, the simple answer it would be as along the trade routes, along the major river routes into this Atlantic trading system, as part of the toing and froing of materials and ideas between the Atlantic zone and the consuming areas of West Central Europe. So one can begin to build a model that actually coheres. And this would fit very nicely with that picture that the early Greeks gave us of the Celts being a Western people living in Spain, living in the extreme west of France. And even Julius Caesar says that the Gauls who call themselves Celts live, and he defines this area here as in the west. So if one puts together the archaeology, the genetics, the new philological readings, and what the classical Greeks in the 6th and 5th century said, there is a coherent picture of Celtic origins in an Atlantic zone, not in the zone from which ultimately some Celtic warriors moved down into Italy. Oops. It is possible to put all these bits and pieces together. There is our Celtic warrior. Every bit of him is based on good, solid archaeological evidence. That evidence, that sort of reconstruction would fit for someone in Britain. This is indeed based on British material, or someone in France, or someone fighting in Hungary, or even someone moving into Anatolia. There was, by the 4th century, a warrior class that recognized itself, depicted itself in a particular way, and dressed itself in a particular way, decked out with art which was very distinctive. But that warrior class, which is what the Romans were talking about, is only one aspect, and a late aspect of the whole Celtic story. What I've tried to do there is to develop the whole Celtic story. Now, the Celtic consciousness is very, very important in British and French and Spanish politics today. Very important indeed. These are some Bretons with the flag of Brittany trying to argue, as the Bretons do, that their culture is Celtic. It is very separate from France. They say, we are not French. In the same way as the Galicians in northwestern Iberia say, we are not Spanish. We are Galician. Our culture is Celtic. In the same way that the Welsh and the Irish and the Scots say, we are not English. We are separate. And this idea of the rebellion against the concept of the nation state is something that is gaining momentum in Britain. It's very interesting to discuss why, and in Europe. But the nation state, the construct of the 18th and 19th centuries, no longer has much meaning for people in Europe. People are looking for smaller entities to belong to, and are now looking to the past for which entities they can recognize themselves as belonging to. And this Celtic roots it lies behind all the nationalist movements that there now are along the Atlantic coast. And when archaeologists, this is all predicated, of course, on the old idea of Celts, when archaeologists started saying, well, it's not like that, it's much more complex, and let's explain it to you, there was absolute uproar, political uproar, and archaeologists were accused of trying to take away our identity from us. But I would say it's much more exciting than that. If I were, well, I must be honest, I'm not a Celt in that sense of the word. I'm very much English. But my grandchildren are being brought up bilingually in speaking Welsh and in speaking English. Their mother is Welsh, and I very much respect the identity of these Atlantic communities. But what I would say to them is that what archaeology, what genetics, what the new philology is beginning to show you is that you're not just Johnny-come-latelys, a load of marauding Europeans who happen to have come across as late as the 4th century BC. You are descended from the indigenous people of these islands, and your tradition, your culture is older than that of most of the rest of Europe. So that what archaeology is giving you a deeper and richer identity than that which you perceived of using the old-fashioned models. So that's where we're at the moment. The debate is heating up very nicely. It's a very exciting debate, and one that brings together all these very disparate elements and to try and find some consensus. And I think we're beginning at last to get it. But don't forget that Tolkien quote, which I began with. Anything is possible in the fabulous Celtic twilight, which is not so much a twilight of the gods as of the reason. Thank you very much. Logically, the Basque, and linguistically, the Basque country lies outside the zone in which the Celtic language developed. It's archaeologically not part of the Atlantic system, strangely enough, doesn't become part until much later. And yet, that is where the geneticists are saying that the genetic signature of comes. Now, this could be that we both could be right. And they're talking about that genetic signature coming in the immediate period after the retreat of the ice. Their dating is, pretty crude, and some people don't believe they can date anyway, but if we accept what they say, they're talking about an early, perhaps, what would it be, perhaps 9th, 8th millennium. Now, what I'm talking about is the develop. So that might be when one gets population movements. But there is the suggestion that another form of it is very complex, I'm sorry, another form of community, Neolithic community, is beginning to move out of the Mediterranean, Indo-European speaking, out of the Mediterranean into the Atlantic and setting up communities along the Atlantic seaways sometime in the sort of 4000-ish period. And some of them are moving across that narrow neck of France to settle in the Atlantic coast of France. And they are the bringers, perhaps, of the Indo-European. So the genetic movement, the movement of our gene pool, predates the settlement of the Neolithic economy, Neolithic economies. And my argument would be that the Neolithic, it is in the Neolithic period that these exchange routes really get underway. And that is the time, out of that Indo-European element, that is the time when Celtic could start to develop, when all those areas are in contact with each other. So one's got to separate those two layers out. But I think both the archaeologists and the geneticists have got to be far more, refine their data far more. And there's a lot of work going on this now, on this whole Atlantic coast genetics. There are, to my knowledge, 3 major research programs going on in British universities on this. And I'm hoping to get most of the people together in a conference with the philologists in Wales in December. But thank you for focusing on that real question. Yes, please.
Curious about the Latin culture. Now, are those people genetically also Celtic, or are they only
The Latin culture, in the past, of course, people have lumped that culture together with concept of Celticness and so on. All we can say is that the culture is practiced by people, many of whom were Celtic speaking. And if being a Celt is Celtic speaking, then many of the users of Latin culture were Celts. That far we can go. But what you can't say is those who don't use Latin culture were not Celts. And that's where we differ from the old arguments. Yes, please.
I was curious about Scandinavian connection
Yeah.
between Norway and Sweden because the art is very similar.
Mm-hmm.
But was that also, do you think that's through trade? Or do you think there's a deeper connection between the two cultures?
I think that in the period, throughout most of prehistory, the Atlantic system really didn't impinge, strangely, very much on the Baltic countries, on the Scandinavian countries. Their cultural axis, was far more through the big rivers of Poland and so on, down to Central Europe and Eastern Europe. That was the great axis of cultural development. So really, one could argue that the Baltic system is a continental European system and is different from the Atlantic system. There were overlaps, of course, but not significant ones. Yes, please.
In the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland, my family's from there.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of Viking history there. Is there any evidence of Celts interacting with Vikings?
Well, yes, strictly. If one argues, as I think one can, that the Orkneys are part of the Atlantic seaways, culturally they are absolutely, and that there's no real evidence of Celtic being spoken there, but absence of evidence, not evidence of absence, as it were. So one could argue that the Orkneys were part of this Celtic Atlantic West. When the Vikings came, which is in the 8th, I think the earliest ones were 700 and something AD, that population, that Celtic population, came into contact with the Viking population. And the Vikings settled, as you will well know, in Orkney, and did contribute. Historically, we know they contributed to the culture of the Orkneys, and that can be recognized in the genetics. It's perfectly possible to recognize the Nordic signature in the genetics of the Orkney, Shetland, and Scotland, and in parts of Ireland as well. So the answer is yes, they did come into contact, and it was the ancestral Celts, as it were, coming through into the 7th century AD who were confronted by the Vikings. And the culture now, the Orkney culture, is, as you will know, a mixed culture of both. Yes, please.
What are some of the characteristics that the modern Celts are using to distinguish and say, this is what's different about us?
Yeah. It is basically language. Language is the prime mover. This all started actually in the 19th century with the French, with the Bretons, wanting to distinguish themselves from the French and calling on the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish as our brothers and our cousins to join us in this struggle against the French and the English. It's a very interesting one, but it is language, and it is elements of culture. The idea of the bagpipes being played in all these areas, right down into Galicia. The idea of tartan clothes, again, there's some element of that. So all of that is okay, but then they start sort of playing with archaeology and get it wrong, and it's that we've got to be careful of.
Are there any elements of physical characteristics like fair hairs?
Yes, there are some. I've never been too convinced about that sort of thing because we are such a mixture. But a certain sort of red-hairedness. The Romans noticed this. They said that the Caledonians were quite distinct from the rest of the English with their red hair and their fierceness. And this red hair gene it's a double recessive, isn't it? But it does come down through that area. There's a certain stockiness as well. But it is really language. But the idea of if I can just expand on this, this is an area that fascinates me. The idea of music, too, is what they are creating, the idea of Celtic music, pentatonic scale, and so on. They are creating a very distinct modern music that is Celtic. Modern pop groups, the best pop groups in Brittany, keep referring back to the past musical traditions of the area. There's a great inter-Celtic festival held in Lorient in Brittany every year, which is a music festival that people from all over the Celtic world come to. And you get the Scots and the Irish and everyone playing. And in fact, in parts of Brittany, if you want to buy books on Irish culture and Scottish culture, you go to Brittany bookshops to buy them. You know, there is that much cultural mixing and embracing. And it is, I just wish someone would study it properly politically and socially. It is a very, very interesting phenomenon. Yes, please.
In the Middle East, there are Kurdish segments in various countries of, and I won't detail that, but that are trying to, or that are fearing, the states are fearing the unification of the question. Is there a Celtic unification movement along that Atlantic seaboard, and is this distressing any of the traditional states in the region?
Yes, I think it is. There's no sense of, well, I'll come back to that. There is no real sense of us, of them getting together as one political unit. It is very much, I think, the concept which we have because of Europe becoming so dominant in our lives as a concept and becoming so important. I think the nation state is becoming less and less significant to people. So many of us feel we owe allegiance to Europe as a concept. And we need something else to hold on to, which is less than a nation state. It is perhaps our Welshness or our Bretonness that we need. And it's not just the Atlantic fringe. I mean, the Catalans and the Andalusians and so on, Corsicans, Languedoc, all those areas are beginning to try and distinguish themselves from the nation state of France or Spain. So it's a social need to feel that you belong to something smaller against the rise and dominance of the concept of Europe and globalization generally. But there is one little political move which I find fascinating in the European movement, the proper European movement. There is this great economic axis which people call the hot banana, which links middle part of England, the industrial heartland of England, right across to really Milan, right the way through Europe, the great zone of industrial strength and might and so on. That's where the power lies. And those states that are European community states living on the Atlantic have banded together and called themselves the states of the Arc Atlantique, the Atlantic arc, that we are similar, and they are developing economic ties, special economic ties, to counterbalance the other economic factor of Europe. So that again is very interesting. It's where archaeology relates to the real world. Yes, yes, please.
What made the Celts so successful militarily? It seems like they were very successful in what they did, but they were able to conquer the Romans.
Or they beat the Romans from time to time. They didn't actually conquer them, but they did beat them from time to time. What made them? Well, their social system was predicated on the raid as being the means of gaining social status or redisplaying social status. So if you wanted to rise in the hierarchy, you would lead a raid, and you would come back with women and cattle and goods and so on, and you would redistribute them to those who joined you, and you would be seen to be great. The next time you said, I'm going to lead a raid, more people would join you. So the raid was a way of building your entourage and your network of clients. And that system requires the elite to maintain a separate existence from the food-producing side of the community. so that the elite can be a mobile elite and go off and raid for months on end, and then come back to their home bases. That's what they did from the Po Valley. That was a home base. They raided up from that. Serbia was a home base. They raided up from that. Galatians was a home base. They raided up from that and then went back again. So it was in the nature of that society that military prowess was what it was about. And they were so good that, I don't want to give the impression they always fought against the Romans. Quite often they fought for the Romans. That one way they could gain prowess was to serve in the Roman armies as auxiliary groups, so as mercenary groups. So many of them worked as mercenaries in the classical world as well. So it's bedded in their society, really, I think. Yes, please.
The way the Scots have been this kind of mercenary kind of thing in fighting.
Yes, that's right. The clan system and the sense of holding together as a group and fighting anywhere for someone who is worth fighting for. Yes, absolutely. Yes, please.
With regards to like the Black Irish and the Picts, who, from what I've read, were descendants of the Neolithics.
Yep.
And then the Red Irish coming in.
Yep.
Is that still
Yes.
still hold true with regards to the Reds still come up and sort of conquer?
What is still accepted, or what is now accepted, is that the Picts are very much an indigenous people who can be traced right back into this sort of Neolithic melee, that they're not someone who've moved in. They are essentially the indigenous people, the descendants of the indigenous tribes in Scotland. That they would still be called Celtic in that they were Celtic speakers. If your sense of what is Celtic is you speak Celtic, then yes, they are. Yes, yes, please.
In the Roman sarcophagus that you showed, some people have argued that the figure on the far bottom left being trampled
Yeah.
is a female. And I'm wondering, there are traditions of Celtic
Yep.
Gaelic women warriors, and I'm wondering what the archaeological evidence is. Is it supported or not supported?
Oh, yes. That in Celtic society, women could reach positions of great importance. There's no doubt. The burial at Vix, the famous burial near, in sort of eastern France, a very rich burial, is the burial of a female. And that is a burial style that is used for rich males as well. So females could be very important. And in certainly the British tradition, we have Queen Boudica and Queen Cartimandua, who were both first century AD war leaders in their own right, and able to lead the tribe as a powerful person. And there's been quite a lot of work on gender, and how in the British Iron Age, and how important gender was, or how insignificant was it in terms of either gender could be buried in the same way. Either gender could have the same attributes of wealth, could lead armies, and whether gender really was very significant after all in some of these societies at a certain level. Whether your status at a particular status transcended the gender differences. Yeah, I did hear that. I've never looked at that particular figure carefully. But I'll go back and have a look at it later. Thank you. Yes, please. Maritime? Oh, yes. I think there were two traditions of shipbuilding in the Atlantic seaways. One was a plank-built tradition, and one was a skin-built tradition. Now, the plank-built tradition really only got underway when bronze tools came in. You could work these great thick planks and sew them together and make proper boats, but with stone. But it was very difficult. But once bronze came in, around about 2400, then you get this great takeoff of the plank-built ship tradition. And we've got a number of these boats now, or bits of them preserved around the coasts of Britain. But I think the most important element of maritime interaction was the skin boat. And there are plenty of descriptions of these in the classical sources. We don't have one archaeologically, but in the classical sources, many descriptions of the skin boats made of wickerwork with skins sewn on them. And there is a brilliant little gold model about this sort of big, 30 centimetres or so, 25, 30 centimetres, from Breton in Northern Ireland, which dates to 100 BC, thereabouts. And it is of a skin boat with a sail, cross-rigged, central, and I think it's 5 thwarts on which the rowers would have sat, and 5 sets of oars. So these skin boats can be quite big. And I think, perhaps the analogy is the umayak, the big boat that you can make of skin. Of course, the Irish still have, well, they're not skin boats now, but they're made of tarpaulin, which has been coated in resins or in tar. And I've actually been out on one. They're called currachs, and they're wonderful. They just sort of bounce on the water. They're stunning. So I think the skin boat tradition, but we haven't got one archaeologically. One will be found eventually, but it's very simple technology. And I think, therefore, it's the technology that was available, certainly in the Mesolithic period, when plenty of working of skin, plenty of working of small wood, making fish traps and so on. No problem at all. Technically, they could have made the boats as early as the Mesolithic period, or even earlier. Yes, please.
So the Irish have the tradition of several invasions coming in, some from Spain. Does that correlate with the Atlantic?
Yes, I wouldn't say they have the tradition of invasions. That's right. In the Irish literature, there is the sense of people coming from abroad. In the archaeological evidence, there is constant contact between Ireland and the Atlantic seaways until sometime around, get this right, about 500 BC, when the archaeological evidence suggests that Ireland became a backwater for a while, for 300 or 400 years. No idea why. There seems to be a decline in population. It may just have been some sort of famine or something, hardly a potato famine, but a famine of some sort. But until about 500 BC, Irish material culture and architecture was part of an Atlantic tradition. And after this short period, it becomes part of an Atlantic tradition again. And certainly in the period of the saints, the 4th century to the 8th century, the seaways were very important for missionaries going out from Ireland to other parts of the Atlantic and other parts of Europe. So Ireland, except for that short period, has been interconnected in this web of connectedness. Please. Yes. Well, I'm on slightly dodgy ground here, but let me tell you what I know of it. I'm going to fall back on the "it's not quite my period" argument, but there is plenty of evidence of Christianity in Roman Britain as early as the 3rd century, if not earlier. So there were enclaves of Christians in Britain early in the Roman period. There's no doubt about that. What? No, oh, well, as the Roman world was Christianizing, Britain was Christianizing with it. It wasn't sort of holding back on this. So as Christian enclaves occurred in various parts of the Roman world, so in Britain. One of the items I excavated from the Roman spring, this in Bath, I found a series of curses which had been written on sheets of lead. And to make sure you curse the right person, you put down all the parameters. I don't know who he is, but he may have been any one of these people, and he lists them all, dozens of names, whether it be male or female, freedman or slave, and one of them says Christian or pagan. So it actually says that. So the Christians were a group, recognised as a group in Britain. The Patrick, the historical Patrick, presumably is a member of one of these Christian communities in Britain, who is, as you will know from the history, captured by the Irish who are raiding and goes across. There are already Christian enclaves there in Ireland, and that may have come about as sort of interaction between Roman Britain and Ireland, possibly as early as the 3rd century AD. So Patrick was coming from a Christian enclave in Britain to an Ireland where there was some knowledge of Christianity. The difference is that Irish Christianity developed in a different way to Roman-style Christianity in Britain, and it became very much the idea of the person, the pilgrim going into the desert, living in the desert, picking up this idea of the desert Christians from the Mediterranean, really, and part of this Atlantic tradition again, and then flowing out from there as missionaries, from there and from Wales as missionaries back into Europe. So it's a sort of reflux. Yes, please?
What were some of the characteristics of the pagan religion, like say, like Celtic culture
Yeah. Wow, that would keep us a while. Okay. I think we could say that they worshipped very large numbers of gods. This is what the Romans tell us, and this is what the archaeology supports. A large number of gods, and they were of two broad kinds. One kind was the god of the place, the actual location, and the other, and that was usually a god of the earth, and the other was a sort of more tribal concept of God, who related to the sky. So you've got this not conflict, but difference between earth, usually female deities, and sky, usually male deities. But there were many, many of them, and different areas had their favorite deities. Many of the female deities resided, were thought to reside in sacred springs and in lakes and rivers. The spring I've excavated in Bath was sacred to Sulis, the name we know from inscriptions, who was a female deity, and when the Romans came, they conflated Sulis with Minerva. So under the Romans, it became Sulis Minerva. So the Romans carried on the tradition of pagan Celtic religion. Many of the Celtic sanctuaries, the small sanctuary sites, carried on to become temples in the Roman period. There is the concept of human sacrifice as well, which Julius Caesar and others write about. There was undoubtedly human sacrifices, plenty of archaeological evidence for that. And the idea of a priesthood being all-powerful, the Druids. Again, what the classical writers tell us about the Druids, if you sieve through it and balance it, it is coherent, and it fits with the archaeological evidence. They don't prove each other, but it fits. The Druids were the wise class of lawgivers and teachers, and the essence was that you couldn't, as an ordinary person, communicate with the gods yourselves. You had to communicate with the gods through the mediation of a Druid. So that, in a nutshell, is some elements of Celtic religion. Yeah. Yes. The purest early DNA, as you saw from that map, is in Ireland. And as you come in, Scotland is pretty pure, Wales less so, England less so. And it's because the English bit has had successive immigrations. After all, the English bit was the bit where the Romans came and settled. And there was must have been a fair amount of Roman genetics sort of imposed on the British population, because soldiers came from Europe, from various parts of Europe and married and settled in Britain. Then we do get an influx of Germanic peoples, the Saxons and the Jutes and all that lot coming, we know archaeologically, historically, coming in. And then, as you say, we get the Vikings coming in again and settling and marrying. But most of that, not all of it, but most of that impinged upon what we now call England and was much less dominant in the Celtic fringe areas. And that's why there is that difference. And it is possible to recognize the Nordic signature, the Viking signature, very easily. And less easily it's possible to recognize some of the Germanic signatures in our genes. So yes, the English are more mongrel than the Scots and the rest of them. Yes, please.
Was there an overlap in Denmark? You have the answer very well in Denmark. How big of an area did they cover?
The items of Latin metalwork did get into Denmark, there's no doubt. But I don't think that Denmark was part of what one would have regarded as the Celtic world, either seen through the eyes of the classical world or seen through archaeology or language. Denmark is very much part of the Germanic world, but because it's where it is, it's very much on the border of the two worlds. And because it's maritime, of course, there were exchanges, maritime exchanges, but it's far more looking down into the Germanic world and rather separate. Yes, please. Yeah, yeah.
Over here, and there should have been some kind of record of how they got there, or some possible, missing links here.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any missing links?
Yeah. Yes. The whole Indo-European question and its relationship to archaeology is another one of these hot debates. But there is a broad sort of area of agreement, I think, that the best context for the Indo-European languages or language group to enter the European peninsula is in the Neolithic period, with the spread of food production. That this is not that there are alternative views, but this is one that many people hold. That it is the spread of food production that takes with it the spread of the Indo-European language. And we can trace the spread of food production through Europe in two main arms. One arm of food production went, it started from Anatolia into Greece and then across into the Danube region and widely through the centre part of Europe, hitting the French coast in around the Seine Valley, that sort of area. And that movement took place in the 6th millennium BC. And parallel with that, there was another movement from the same sort of area through the Mediterranean, colonizing the Mediterranean islands and probably North Africa, and around the coast of southern France, the Mediterranean coast of France, the Levantine coast of the Iberian Peninsula, and out into the Atlantic and settling on the Atlantic coast of Portugal now. So you've got at about the same time. And in the Atlantic zone, you've got these two arms mixing and merging along the Atlantic. A view we could take is that it is as part of that movement of, it's not just a movement of people, that people did move, but quite often short movements. It's a movement of concepts and beliefs and technologies and so on. But with that, which was totally different to the hunter-gatherer communities before, much more complex, with that spread the European language to much of Europe quite quickly. There were enclaves like the Basques where it didn't get. And from that, the languages that we recognize as Slavic and Germanic and the Latin languages and the Celtic languages all emerged from that base language. Our argument is that the Celtic language was simply one of those that emerged in a particular zone, in the same way that the Italic emerged in a particular zone, and so on. And this would be reasonably consistent. There are alternative views being put forward, one which introduces a Semitic language into the equation as well. But that hasn't been argued through in sufficient detail yet. But the base view of people like Colin Renfrew and so on is that it's the Neolithic period that sees the movement of the Indo-European into Europe. Any more? One more. Yes?
You mentioned that, for example, your grandchildren are being instructed in Welsh.
Yeah.
Is there more research nowadays to provide?
Yeah. Yes, I think it's almost too late in many areas, and that's the enormous sadness of this. In Wales is the only area where the language is growing in strength, and that is because of political will. The Welsh government is reasonably separate from the English government in many ways. There's a Welsh assembly, and they have said that anyone who has a job, a government job in Wales, has to speak Welsh. So if you're a school teacher, you have to speak Welsh. If you're a civil servant, you have to speak Welsh. And that has strengthened the language enormously. And Welsh is spoken in all the schools, not always as the main language of teaching, but is always spoken in all the schools. The language is actually growing there. In the other Celtic countries, it is declining. Brittany is the one I know best, and there's been a stunning decline in the spoken language, a saddening decline. There are still groups who keep it alive, and they sing in Welsh, in Breton, and they make films in Breton, and they're Breton railway stations, Breton radio stations. But in Ireland, it's declining fast, and except in certain enclaves in Scotland, it's declined very fast. I heard a frightening statistic about Ireland and its languages the other day. Now, Ireland has had a lot of culture change as part of becoming part of the European Union, an inflow of a huge amount of resource and people. And the first language of Ireland is English. The second language of Ireland is Polish. The third language of Ireland is Chinese. And the fourth language is Irish. And that shows you the sort of change. It's all come about quite recently. And unless there is a real concerted effort in these Celtic countries to assert their language, they're going to be dead within a few generations. But that said, the Cornish, where Celtic died out in the 18th century, are re-establishing their language now. But they're having to reconstruct it, and that's a little bit false. They've got some of the Cornish words, but not all of them. So they're having to import words from Breton to fill the gaps. And they can't agree. There are 2 or 3 groups trying to reconstruct Cornish, and those groups can't agree with each other, which is the authentic reconstruction. So I don't think there's much hope there. But there is hope, I think, if there was a political will, and they followed the Welsh example, the languages could just still revive. make this the last one. Yes? Manx, yep, sure. That was another one of these languages that has notionally died out, but is still, some words are still known by some. There is a little bit of a movement to re-establish Manx, but not as much as as the Cornish. The Cornish are getting quite belligerent and are asking for local, for their own regional government as well. And why not? You know, I would strongly support that if I were Cornish. Right, I think I'll stop there. Thank you.